There's something about this time of year that feels a little bit magical. Something that makes even the most cynical among us a little bit more open to hope and possibility. This year, we're leaning into that magic and wonder with this Advent series about the miracles of the Christmas story. The mysteries that just can't be explained and that maybe don't need to be. So far, we've talked about the angels and the star. This week, we're talking about probably the greatest miracle of the entire Christian story, the miracle of God becoming human. And that miracle begins at Christmas with the birth of Jesus, a tiny baby born in a nowhere town to a family of nobodies. Or maybe this miracle actually began before the world even existed. Let's hear what the Gospel of John has to say in chapter 1. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. He was with God in the beginning. Through him all things were made. Without him nothing was made that has been made. In him was life, and that life was the light of all humanity. The light shines in the darkness, and the darkness has not overcome it. The Word became flesh and made his dwelling among us. We have seen his glory, the glory of the one and only Son who came from the Father, full of grace and truth. The Word in these opening lines of John refers to Jesus, who is both with God and is God from the very beginning of the universe. Jesus was there at the creation of the earth and participated in the act of giving life to everything that exists. The Old Testament tells us stories of God's relationship with humanity from day one. God didn't create us and then abandon us. God remained present and active with God's people, calling them to build families and communities, giving them instructions on how to live together and care for one another, getting frustrated when they didn't listen and chose greed and injustice instead, guiding them back to the right way over and over again, all from a distance, speaking to them through dreams and prophets and burning bushes and from mountaintops. At some point, God seemed to decide that God wanted to get closer to humanity, that the way things had been was no longer good enough. So God decided to become human, not to simply appear in the form of a human, a cosmic game of dress up. No, God, going by the name Jesus, put on human flesh and became one of us. God became vulnerable in all the ways that we are vulnerable. Let's really think about that for a moment. Jesus was fully human. Jesus was born into this world like the rest of us, pink and slimy and screaming with everything those little lungs had in them. He had a mother who labored for hours, who felt his kicks and hiccups in the womb, who held that messy little infant against her chest and marveled how it was possible to love someone so much. As a newborn, Jesus probably kept Mary and Joseph up at night crying with hunger. He grew into a toddler who threw tantrums and took stumbling first steps. He definitely had a "but why" phase that drove Mary a little crazy, even as she delighted in his curiosity. As a teenager, Jesus experienced that awkward stage when your body is changing and your voice is cracking, and some days you have a zit the size of Jupiter. He played and fought with his younger siblings in equal measure. He got sick and had headaches and random bruises from helping out in Joseph's carpenter shop. Sometimes he was grumpy when he got up in the morning. He grew into an adult who experienced the full breadth of what it means to be human. He got annoyed with other people and was sarcastic and sometimes rude, but he also experienced love, and he had inside jokes with his friends. He laughed so hard his stomach hurt and tears were in his eyes. He enjoyed delicious meals and maybe occasionally had a little too much wine. He was like all of us with his likes and dislikes, his good days and bad, joys and sorrows. There's a tendency in Christian theological spaces to want to dismiss or diminish Jesus' humanity and emphasize only his divinity. There are arguments over exactly how it is possible for Jesus to be both fully divine and fully human. Some even say that Jesus only looked human and was actually more divine than not. There are fancy words for how these things might work or not work. It's understandable that we want to have a logical or scientific explanation for the incarnation of Jesus. Incarnation means the act of the divine putting skin on. But I invite us to step back and embrace the mystery of it all. The miracle of God loving God's creation so much that God fully became part of it in a way that makes no sense. There was no logical reason for a divine being to be this invested in our lives and our well-being, and yet God was and is. I think sometimes we struggle with the idea of God becoming human because, in general, we have a low opinion of our bodies and of humanity in general. Maybe it goes all the way back to the creation and fall story in Genesis. The first thing Adam and Eve do after eating the fruit from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil is realize they are naked and become ashamed of their bodies. I don't think we've ever stopped being ashamed. Christian teaching has often divorced the body from the soul, the physical from the spiritual. The body is seen as bad, unholy, dirty, something to be ashamed of and ignored. Maybe that's why many Christians love quotes like, "You do not have a soul. You are a soul. You have a body." C.S. Lewis never said that, by the way. That quote so perfectly captures this belief in Christianity that because our bodies are temporary, they don't matter very much. The most important thing is the care of our souls, which explains why some traditions put more emphasis on saving souls for Christ than feeding hungry people. You don't have to be a Christian to have a bad relationship with your body. We live in a culture that teaches us to treat our bodies like the enemy. It doesn't matter who you are or what you look like. Everyone has probably had at least one negative thought about their body. I don't need to list out every possible insecurity you might have. You know what they are. We are taught to constantly work on fixing or improving our physical appearance through workout regimens, diets, skincare routines, and makeup tutorials. And even if we follow all of that advice, spend all of that money, there will always be something else to fix. We will never be enough. And that's not even considering those whose bodies deviate so far from the norm to begin with. The norm that idealizes white, thin, able-bodied persons as being the most beautiful. Taking all of this into consideration, it's no wonder that we are tempted to downplay Jesus' humanity, to idealize his divinity and strive for that kind of spiritual perfection instead. But God doesn't view being human like we do. In Genesis 1, God creates humanity and after doing so, looks down on them and declares them good. God is delighted by the humans God has created, and even when we are messy and imperfect, God doesn't leave us alone. God decides that the best way to do God's work in the world is through a human body. Professor Vance Morgan writes, "The most profound truth of Christianity is that God became flesh, became mundane, became embodied in the world that God created. And this incarnational activity continues in us. We are God's hands and feet. God becomes human, and in doing so reminds us that our flesh is holy. Our bodies are not something to be ashamed of, but something to marvel at, to cherish. This body of ours, with all its perceived flaws and differences, is sacred simply because the creator of the universe breathed life into it and declared it good. We forget this at our own peril." Black theologian Cole Arthur Riley writes that we were never meant to dismember our selfhoods. My face is my soul, is my blood, is my glory. When we neglect the physical, it inevitably suffocates the image of a God who ate, slept, cried, bled, grew, and healed. And whether or not the origin of that neglect is hatred, it will indeed end in hatred. Jesus' ministry was a visceral, physical experience. He taught spiritual truths, yes, but he also fed hungry people. healed sick bodies, touched lepers, cried with friends who were grieving, took naps, and died a very real, very violent physical death. Jesus didn't separate the physical from the spiritual, so neither can we. Jesus says that the greatest commandment is to love the Lord your God and love your neighbor as yourself. Loving our neighbors doesn't mean loving them in abstract theory. It means loving them as concrete physical reality. Our neighbors have bodies just like we do. And sometimes I wonder if we project our own physical insecurities and hatred for our bodies onto our neighbors. If we spend so much time trying to fit into that ever elusive norm, then of course we will expect everyone else to do the same. Of course we will start to resent or despise people who look different from us or what we consider ideal and normal. We've seen the effects of this throughout history. Wars and genocides and segregation and enslavement. Laws regulating what people, particularly women, trans, queer, disabled, and people of color, can or cannot do with their bodies. How they can dress, what bathrooms they can use, what healthcare they can access, what language they can speak, what jobs they can work. As if their bodies are somehow less holy, less sacred, less God-created because we said so. God never asked us to hate our bodies. Jesus ran toward people with all kinds of bodies, including and especially those whom society deemed less than or disgusting. Jesus saw every body as holy, as beautiful, as capable of telling the story of divine love. Jesus preached a kingdom that needed everybody to make it a reality, a kingdom of love and justice and equality, where everyone with a body can thrive. This is the work of the incarnation. God is still working through each of us, both our minds and our bodies. They are one and the same. And I don't understand it. I can't explain the exact science behind it, but I know it to be true. I know that every human is a miracle, every body a marvel. I know that our bodies have so much to teach us and that they deserve more love and care than we give them. And I wonder what the world would look like if we truly believed in the sacredness and goodness of our bodies. If we stopped hating our bodies and instead started loving them as God loved them, reveling in the miracle that God loved them enough to become one of us and make a home among us. Amen.